Welcome, welcome. Good morning, everyone. We are so glad that you're with us. My name's Eric. I'm going to be your host, and we are glad you're here at Journey Christian Church, where our mission is to invite and lead people into a growing relationship with Jesus Christ. Now, we are in the middle of part 3 of our series on sexuality and gender, and I'm so proud of our church for tackling some of the most pervasive cultural issues that our society is dealing with. Now, today, some of the content the sermon may be sensitive for younger listeners. So parents of little ones, if you have a child in elementary or preschool, we encourage and invite you to explore our environments built just for them, Wambaland and Upstreet today. Now we're going to be together for 70 minutes today. We are going to be hearing from our senior pastor, but before we get to that, I invite you to stand up, say hello to a neighbor as we prepare to sing and worship with our band.
What's up, neighbors? How their neighbors doing today? Come on, we ready to praise this morning? All right. Praise can be a weapon, right? So we can use that to just take out some things that are going on in our lives. We're going to sing about that this morning. This session's going to sing super loud. I can feel it. Come on. Let praise be a weapon that silences the enemy. Let praise be a weapon that conquers all anxiety. Changes everything. We sing with all we are and we claim
Jesus, the name above every other name. Jesus, the only one who could ever save. Worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you. Oh, we live for you.
Sing
Holy, there is no one like you. There is none beside you. Open up my eyes in wonder. Show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love to those around me. Come on, you guys know those words. Sing it again, worthy. Worthy of every song we could ever sing. Worthy of all the praise we could ever bring. Yes, he is. Worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you, only for you. Jesus, the name above every other name. Jesus, the only one who could ever save.
That's truth right there. Come on.
Worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you. Oh, we live for you. Holy, there is no one like you. There is none beside you. Open up my eyes in wonder. Show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love to those around me. And I will build
Come on, church,
my
we know it.
life upon your love.
Let's hear you.
It is. Amen.
This is what heaven sounds like. Come on.
In you alone.
Keep it going. Come on.
Isn't that amazing? Sing it again. I will build my life upon your love. It is a firm foundation, and I will put my trust in you alone, and I will not be shaken. Holy, there is no one like you. There is none beside you. Open up my eyes in wonder and show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love to those around me. Amen, church.
Come on now. Who believes in this place that our God can do great things? Right? Come on, there's a history full of it. There's a book that we preach from that talks about these great things. And if it happened then, it's happening now. It's going to keep on happening because that's the God that we serve. That's the God that we love. Can we sing about the great things that He's done on this next one? Come on. Come on.
Come, let us worship our King. Come, let us bow at His feet. He has done great things. Who believes that? Yes, He has. See what our Savior has done. See how His love overcomes. He has done great things. Sing that again. He has done great things.
Come on, hero of heaven. Come on.
Oh, hero of heaven, you conquered the grave. You free every captive and break every chain. every captive. Yes.
You have done great. Come on.
We dance in your freedom, awakened alive. Oh Jesus, our Savior, your name lifted high, oh God. You have done great things. You have done great things. Oh God, you do great things. We're gonna do that one more time. We're gonna sing Oh Hero.
All we got, let's go.
Oh hero of heaven,
Come on.
you conquered the grave. You have done great.
We dance, come on. You have done great. We repeat it, come on.
You have done great
So
things.
one more time.
Oh God, you do great things. Amen. Amen. You guys are a beautiful choir.
Come
I
on
just had
now.
to point that out.
I've said it
Beautiful
3
choir.
times, but this is what heaven sounds like. Can you just imagine that moment? Come on now. Come on. Will you pray with me this morning? Dear God, we take this opportunity to thank you for giving us the opportunity right now to praise you for all that you are, God. You are working great things in lives, Jesus. We are a small part of a greater plan, Jesus, and we choose to believe that this morning, God. You've done great things in the past. You're working in lives right now, whether we see it or not. You are working for our good because we love you, and that's your promise. You're going to continue to do great things in the future, and we love you and praise you and just acknowledge that, the simplicity of that. We ask for a special blessing on this service. We pray for James as he delivers some strong words this morning. We love you and we praise you, our King Jesus. All the church said, amen.
Amen. Well, y'all can be seated. Y'all sound fantastic. Listen, just really quickly, I wanted to thank you all for your support. You know, often we talk about the support that you provide and the impact that it has on environments within the church, and sometimes we don't talk about the environments outside of these walls. Well, one of the community ministries that we support here is with Mercy Mall. How many of y'all know Mercy Mall? Yeah, it's an awesome ministry, nonprofit that provides tangible items, household goods, clothing to those in need. Also providing the hope of Jesus along the way. And recently we got a letter from them, and I just wanted to read it to you to talk about the impact that we're having on individuals through Mercy Mall. It says, "Dear Journey, we served a client that had abruptly left her abuser without knowing how she would provide for her and her daughter. She relied only on faith that God would sustain her and keep them safe. They lived in a hotel for months and just recently got into new housing. When she came to pick up her clothing and household items from us, she was beside herself. She was overwhelmed with the love and the support that was provided to her that she began praising God and worshiping Him right there in the parking lot. Whether our clients know about Christ's love and light or not, they leave Mercy Mall knowing that God's people love them. So Journey, this is what your generosity does. It helps us share the love and light with those who may be in darkness. You help our volunteers be the hands and feet of Jesus to individuals and families in crisis in a time when they may be hearing no or not right now from many other organizations. God is using your gifts to bless local families in crisis. Thank you, and that's what your generosity is doing. Let's prepare our hearts and especially our minds for this series on sexuality and gender.
you're still here. That's great. Well, today we continue our conversation about human sexuality and gender. And if you've missed any part of this series, I really encourage you to go back, listen to part 1 and listen to part 2, because these messages kind of build on themselves and help give us context for what we're going to be talking about in the weeks to come. And so if you've missed any one of them, please go back. And some of you are going back and watching them multiple times because you're trying to really become proficient in this whole conversation. And goodness knows we need to become proficient. It's not good enough just to say, yeah, I agree with that. It's going to be something that we have to internalize so that we can dialogue with our family, our friends, our coworkers, and people that we love and care about. Now, last week, we looked at what God thinks, or why our sexuality is so important to God. That was what we talked about last week. We discovered that, and I was going to move on from that, but this week in prepping again for the message, I just decided, you know what, we're just going to push the pause button again, and instead of talking about why our sexuality is such a big deal to God, and it is, I think we need to look at why our sexuality is such a big deal to our culture. And so today, that's what we're going to be talking about. And we're going to consider that, and hopefully today will be helpful. And in this message today, I'm indebted to a number of writers from whom I have borrowed heavily for the message, including Nancy Piercy, Rosaria Butterfield, and Carl Truman, all of which are scholars in their own right. They teach at the university level, have written much, and so I'm very grateful for their scholarship and for their writing on the topics that we're going to be talking about today. Now, today, our message is going to be a little different than what we normally experience. And so if you've been around Journey for a little while, you'll understand the difference of what we're going to be talking about today and how we approach this. I've got a couple of scriptures I'm going to read at the very beginning, and then I've got one that I'm going to read at the very end, but in the middle is just going to be a lot of content. And so today, I'm really going to need you to engage in your listening skills and your mind, all right? So there's no entertainment today. What we're talking about is very, very serious things. We're going to talk about a number of people who have impacted our world, and we're going to name them by name, and they are all dead, but they rule the world from the grave. And so we're going to be talking about them and how they've impacted our culture. The Apostle Paul wrote to Timothy, who was a young pastor. He says this in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. He says this, "Now the Spirit explicitly says that in later times, some will depart from the faith, paying attention to deceitful spirits and the teachings of demons, through the hypocrisy of liars whose consciences have been seared." And that's exactly what is happening in our culture today. It's been happening for a very long time, as a matter of fact. And the things that we're going to be talking about, they are certainly teachings and philosophies and doctrines of demons. And the people who promoted them, they have no conscience. They really don't. And so we're going to expose that. In fact, Paul says in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 11, "Don't participate in the fruitless works of darkness, but instead expose them. Everything is exposed by the light is made visible, for what makes everything visible is light." And we're going to shine the light on some of these ideologies today that have brewed and really have impacted you and me and our families, our culture. There's no part of our culture that has not been impacted by what we're going to discuss and discover today, and we're going to shine a light on it. And then Paul writes this in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 3 and 4. And really, this is my pastor's heart. This is why we're doing this series, in part. You asked for it, which we talked about in week 1, but as I've watched our culture, I'm concerned for people who follow Jesus. I really am. I'm concerned for our own church. And so really my target audience in this whole series is you. This is not about, I'm not trying to penetrate into the culture. It's for you because I love you and I'm concerned. But this is what Paul wrote to the church in Corinth. "But I fear, as the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, that your minds may be seduced from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. In other words, you'll be led away from your love for Jesus. For if a person comes and preaches another Jesus whom we did not preach, you receive whom we did not preach, or you receive a different spirit which you did not receive, or a different gospel which you had not accepted, you put up with it splendidly. In other words, he's saying you're not practicing any discernment, and when somebody comes up, you're like, that's an interesting idea, and maybe they even might sprinkle a Bible verse or two in there to kind of support what they're saying, and you just kind of swallow it. And that's what Paul is saying here. And then he says, the previous chapter 10, verse 3, he says this, for although we live in the flesh, we do not wage war according to the flesh, since the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but are of power through God for the demolishing of strongholds. We demolish arguments and every proud thing that is raised up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought and make it obedient to Christ. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to expose some very harmful things, and it's as it has seeped out through our culture. As I said, there's no part of our culture that hasn't been affected. There's no one in your family that hasn't been affected, and it is time that we just turn the lights on, and that's what we're going to do. You might remember that in the movie series, The Matrix, that was done years ago, they just did another edition of that movie. The main character, Neo, in that movie series, or in the very first movie, comes to realize that he's kind of trapped in a world that he no longer understands. He's going around and he realizes, hey, this world is not what I thought it was, and I don't even understand that world. And maybe you kind of feel that way about our current world. Things you once regarded as obvious and bedrock virtues have in recent years been subject to vigorous criticism, and even in some cases come to be seen by many as vices, like the opposite. It used to be good, but now it's not good, it's very bad. It can seem as if things that almost everybody believed as unquestioned orthodoxy just a week ago, seems like, now regard as heresies advocated only by the lunatic fringe, people who are dangerous, people who are bigoted. And yet, literally, just a few years ago, the majority of Americans held those very convictions, but no longer. Parents teaching their children traditional views of sex find themselves met with strong resistance by their children, who have absorbed a far different view from the culture around them. In fact, what a parent considers to be a loving response to their child's experiencing same-sex attraction or gender dysphoria might be regarded by the child as hateful and bigoted. And this is true inside the church just as it is in the wider society at large. The generation gap today is reflected not simply by how we dress or our lingo or our music, but it's in the attitudes and beliefs about some of the most basic aspects of our human existence. The results is often confusion, sometimes even heartbreak, as many of the most difficult conversations and things that we talk about happen around the dinner table, happen in our own families. As Carl Trueman says, welcome to the strange new world. You may not like it, he says, but it's where you live, and therefore it's important that you try to understand it. That's what we want to do today. We want to try to understand the world in which we live and how we got to where we are today. One of the things that's really taken root in our current culture is what American scholar Robert Bellah calls expressive individualism. Maybe you're familiar with that idea. And Bellah defines it as follows. Expressive individualism holds that each person has a unique core of feeling and intuition that should unfold or be expressed if individuality is to be realized. Let me say that one more time. He says that expressive individualism holds that each person has a unique core of feeling, some kind of intuition inside of them that should unfold to be expressed if individuality is to be realized. Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, too, sees this expressive individualism as the normative modern notion of selfhood in the West. He specifically connects it to what he dubs the culture of authenticity. Everybody needs to be authentic, which he describes as follows. The culture of authenticity is where each of us has his or her own way of realizing our humanity, and that it is important to find and live out one's own humanity against surrendering to conformity with a model imposed to us from outside by society or the previous generation or religious or political authority. Whatever it is, you don't let anybody impose any kind of standard or morality on you. You've got to live authentically to who you are. So where does all that lead us? Well, it leads us to the belief that authenticity is achieved by acting outwardly in accordance with what we feel inwardly. This notion is now very deep in our modern culture and helps to explain a lot of interesting phenomena that we are experiencing today that just 6, 7, 8 years ago we really weren't experiencing to that great degree. For example, have you noticed the increasing sensitivity to criticizing anyone for their personal lifestyle choice? It reflects the view of the world where each person is free to perform life in whatever way they choose. And any attempt to express disapproval is therefore blown not simply as a particular, a blow, not simply to the particular ways of behaving, but against the right of that person to be whomever they wish to be. That explains the phrases that are so common among us today. You do you. You do you. Be true to yourself. When you understand the idea of expressive individualism, it provides kind of a broad backdrop to what we commonly know as the sexual revolution. Now, when we hear the term sexual revolution, many of us are tempted to think about the ways in which sexual morality has been transformed since the 1960s. Often, we tend to assume that these changes involve the expansion of the range of socially acceptable sexual behavior. Yet it would be a mistake to see the sexual revolution merely in terms of loosening of moral boundaries. It's more than that. What marks the modern sexual revolution out as distinctive is the way it has normalized nearly every and all form of sexual expression. Things that used to be stigmatized in our culture today are celebrated as a normal part of mainstream culture. The sexual revolution does not simply represent growth in the routine transgression of traditional sexual codes or even a modest expansion of the boundaries of what is and is not acceptable sexual behavior. Instead, it's the repudiation, the flat-out repudiation of the very idea of such standards in their entirety. More than that, it has come in certain areas to the point where belief in or maintenance of such views have come to be seen as ridiculous and even a sign of serious mental or moral deficiency. You better keep up with the times. And to understand this, we need to see the sexual revolution as a particularly sharp manifestation of the characteristics of expressive individualism. If the individual's inner identity is defined by sexual desire, then he or she must be allowed to act out on that desire in order to be an authentic person, because we have to be authentic. Obviously, Western society still has some sexual codes and places limits on sexual behavior. Pedophilia, for example, continues for the time being to be outlawed in the United States. But those limits are increasingly defined not so much by the sex acts themselves, but by the issue of whether or not the parties involved have consented to those acts. Again, notice what the sexual revolution has done. It has brought us to the point where sexual acts in themselves are seen as having no intrinsic moral significance. It's the consent or not of those engaging in them that provides the moral framework. So if we take the most dramatic developments of the sexual revolution, say the legitimization of something like transgenderism, it is interesting to ask what wider things society already needed to regard as normal in order for this to be first plausible and then normalized itself. The sentence, "I'm a woman trapped in a man's body," would have been nonsense to your grandparents. Had it been uttered by somebody to a doctor in the past 75 years or 75 years ago, the doctor would almost certainly have responded to the patient that they had a psychiatric problem and that their mind needed to be treated so as to bring its feelings into line with their physical body. Today, the doctor is more likely to respond that the problem is such that the patient's body needs to be brought into alignment with those inner feelings. In fact, if a doctor were to respond as she would have 75 years ago, she would find herself subject to legal action and losing her license. So what has changed so drastically to bring this new situation about? The 18th century philosopher Rousseau was born in 1712 and died in 1778. His influence is still felt today. Rousseau was a bit odd, but he was brilliant. He's self-taught. He was multi-talented. He wrote novels and plays. He tried his hand at musical composition. He worked as a civil servant. He developed philosophies of society and education that continue to influence modern discussions on these very topics. His thought was also an inspiration for both the French Revolution, which was a very bad thing, and the artistic movement that we now know as Romanticism. He was kind of a rather obstinate, nasty, and at times paranoid man. He famously fell out with the contemporary Scottish philosopher David Hume and notoriously sent all 5 of his children to an orphanage almost immediately upon their birth, basically dooming them almost to an early death in his day. Didn't care. Among Rousseau's influence was also that he locates a person's identity in the inner psychological life. Your identity is somewhere buried deep in your psyche. For Rousseau, how a person feels is central to who they are. Another aspect of his influence is that he saw society or culture as exerting a corrupting influence on the self. So society itself was corrupting the individual. So to the extent that society prevents us from acting consistently with our inner feelings, to that extent it prevents us from being who we really are. So in his view, society is the thing that makes us inauthentic. Now, just pause for a second and realize that his idea that society corrupts the individual is in direct contradiction to the biblical teaching that man has a sin nature that we have all inherited from Adam. And so Rousseau flatly rejects this, and instead he teaches that human beings are born essentially moral, good. There's nothing wrong with them. What's wrong is the society around us. For Rousseau, we have a weakness, kind of for flattery. And therefore, we could kind of succumb to the culture around us, the pressure that society puts on us to try to conform in certain ways. And so corruption, for Rousseau, comes from the outside. So what we learn is that we need to be true to ourselves. We need to resist and reject the moral standards of our culture and free us, because we're really in bondage to them. Not far behind Rousseau came Charles Darwin, who was born in 1809 and died in 1892, and with him, Karl Marx. They were contemporaries. Marx was born in 1818 and died in 1883. Both Darwin and Marx were materialists. They believed that this world and the universe is all that there was. There's no transcendent realm, no God or gods behind the material universe that might provide some kind of sacred foundation for any moral order. But Marx's atheism and materialism went further. He believes that the material conditions of life, specifically the economic relations that exist between people decisively shape how we think about reality. Basically, for him, it's those economic relations that have the most profound impact on our self-consciousness and our identity. One implication of this understanding of human identity and relationships is that all forms of human community become political. It's all about politics. So everything from the village sports team to trade unions to they all draw their ultimate significance from the role it plays in the economic and thus political nature of the society around us. Marx also hated any religion, especially Christianity. In his view, intellectual advancement proved that religion was a fraud, and he was angered when people persisted in believing. And so Marx grew to think of religion in three different ways. First, he saw religion as something that man created. At its most positive, religion plays a kind of a psychological need. The pain and suffering that economic alienation causes are alleviated by the false hope of a life of eternal bliss hereafter where all wrongs are righted and peace and justice prevail. It's a fantasy to Marx. Second, he saw that it not only meets the psychological needs of the workers, but it also works in the interest of the bosses of the factory because it enables their workers who are being oppressed to endure their present woes and not rise up in rebellion because they were basically going to be a moral people, so kind of cut both ways. The oppressors liked religion because it kept the little people at bay and they wouldn't rise up. Which leads him to his third idea about religion, and that is that it needed to be demolished at all costs, that hope needed to be demolished, false hope, the debunking of religion. It was vital for him if the working class is to realize their truly desperate nature of its condition and then take action in this world to rectify the situation. You got to get rid of hope, then you get angry, and then you get even and you take it back. It's Marx. With Darwin's theory of evolution, God was no longer needed. And so humanity could progress past religious superstition. We're always progressing. But with the death of God and therefore being freed from the burden of being creatures of God, human beings, we have to rise up to the challenge of self-creation, of being whoever we choose to be. But perhaps even more bluntly, be whoever or whatever works for you. You do you. Whatever works for you. You should feel no obligation to conform to the standards or criteria of anybody else, especially religion, especially Christianity. So, whatever makes us feel good about ourselves, that's what we must do. Morality is, again, something that man makes up. It reflects his personal taste. And this is very helpful when we think through all of this about our current moral climate. So often the language we use reflects cultural intuition. People will speak of morality in terms of taste or aesthetics. That remark was hurtful to me. That idea was offensive. I'm offended. That viewpoint makes me feel unsafe. Now, such expressions don't make a statement about whether or not the situation in hand is right or wrong. It just is a personal opinion. It's just how they feel. And what feels right to them doesn't necessarily make it right for you. My truth is different than your truth. And since God is dead, what are we to do? Well, we create our own ethical code. That's what we do. What is good and evil is simply a matter of taste and preferences, especially for those with the power. And enforcing their ethics on others is how they maintain their power. So we've got to blow up the whole system. With the death of God, self-creation and self-expression are to be pursued, and more than that, celebrated. And now we have an environment where sexuality can become its own religion. One of the most obvious aspects of modern public life is the central role that sex plays in it, if you think about it. From legislation on matters of sexuality to the apparent need for the public to know about the sexual orientation of sports stars and actors and so forth, the role of sex in our culture is pervasive, and really it's never been as high as it is today. And why is this? Why now? Well, the simple answer is that sexual desire has emerged in the last 100 years as a primary category for understanding our identity. Don't miss that. Over the last 100 years, our sexuality has become a primary way for understanding our very identity. In biblical times or in ancient Greece, sex was regarded as something that human beings did. But today, it is considered to be something vital to who human beings are. Hence, we now have the whole notion of sexual identity and the ever-expanding letters to make up the LGBTQ plus alliance. But how do we get here? It's remarkable that among those who adopt a purely materialist worldview often end up turning sex into a substitute religion of sorts. And I'm not making that up. You're going to see this in just a second. And when sex becomes a religion, then nothing is allowed to stand in its way, especially not Christianity and not Christian morality. All the most prominent sexual theorists have been critics of morality and Christianity. They're all atheists. They don't believe in God. They're materialist. They see morality as an obstacle to human happiness, an evil force from which we must be liberated at all costs. Take, for example, Sigmund Freud, born in 1856, died in 1939. Freud was a committed Darwinist, and he taught that sex was purely a biological drive, sheer instinct. This is what he wrote. Pleasure, listen, pleasure, this is Freud, pleasure is the main purpose of our entire mental apparatus. It's all about pleasure. Freud conceded, one historian says that Freud thought of a person as a machine with a satisfaction at its mission. So all you're about and all my about is pleasure and satisfaction. And if anything gets in the way of my pleasure and satisfaction, it is harmful to me. This is the father of modern psychology. Now, Freud did concede that sexual restraint is necessary for civilization. I mean, that was obvious, but he taught that for the individual, it is harmful and unhealthy, leading to neurosis. He had nothing but contempt for people who kept sex within the covenant bond of marriage. And he would write, and I quote, "Only the weaklings have acquiesced in such a gross invasion of their sexual freedom." End quote. And it's obvious that Freud had an enormous influence in persuading the modern world that sexual liberation is the path to mental and sexual health. If you can't be sexually liberated, then you cannot be healthy psychologically or sexually. Freud reasoned that sex is foundational to human happiness. If you can't express your internal sexuality, you cannot be happy. That's the message of Freud. And since, according to the likes of Marx and Nietzsche, God is dead, therefore there isn't any basic intrinsic morality in the human person. Happiness and morality, instead, is something that the individual himself is to create and to discover. And since, according to Freud, sex is essential to happiness, then any restrictions on a person's sexual experience is forbidden. You cannot restrict someone's the nature of their essential happiness. If you do that, it's harmful to them. In fact, the concept we talk a lot about today about sexual orientation, that concept was first introduced by Freud. That's where it came from. Up until Freud, in human history, a person's sexual interests were something they participated in. Now, They were at the core of who that person is. Thanks to Freud, for the first time in history, men and women began to place their identity, who they are, in their sexuality. The effect of all of this, if not the intent of Freud, was to radically resituate sexuality from its biblical and creational context to something completely new, the foundational drive that determines and defines human identity. That's what he wanted sex to be. For Freud, nothing short of personhood was at stake. It's about who you are. And by defining humanity according to sexual desires and segregating it according to its gender object, Freud was, intentionally or not, suppressing the biblical category of being made in God's image, male and female, and replacing it with the psychoanalytic category of sexual identity. In both intent and language, Freud took aim at the Bible's authority to diagnose gender and sexuality dysfunctions and prescribe solutions for them. So no longer was a person made in the image of a holy God. Now it's all about their sexual self. The category of sexual orientation carries with it a cosmology of personhood that undervalues, listen, it undervalues image bearers of a holy God. This trade for identifying ourselves by our sexuality is not a step up. In fact, the bottom dropped out. We went from being men and women made in God's image with souls that will last forever to people whose sexual drives and gender identifications define them. That's not an improvement. While the Bible teaches that image bearing is what sets us humans apart from animals, the 19th century ushered in a new measure of man, one for whom sexuality and sexual pleasure became the defining marker. Thus, Freud's invention of sexual orientation created new identities that robbed people of their true one, male and female image bearers of the Creator God. And then there's Margaret Sanger, founder of Planned Parenthood. She was born in 1879, died in 1966. She was also a critic of morality and Christianity. She was an atheist. She described the great drama of history as the struggle to free our bodies and minds from the constraints of morality, the cruel morality of self-denial and sin. She scoffed at it. In her view, sexual liberation was the only method by which a person could find their inner peace and security and beauty. The only way. It was also the means to advance the next level of evolution, to remodel the race, to create a real civilization. She was a eugenicist. She believed in superior races. And that's what she was all about. Sanger even resorted to explicit religious language. This is what she says, quote, "Through sex, mankind may attain the great spiritual illumination which will transform the world, which will light up the only path to an earthly paradise," end quote. If that's not a religious vision, I don't know what is. Making sex a religion. You see, for materialist thinkers, immersion in the biological instincts became nothing less than a means of salvation. And then there's Alfred Kinsey, born in 1894 to 1956. In the 2000 movie based on his life, they portrayed him as a heroic pioneer. But he is anything but that. He was also an atheist, likewise a critic of morality, of any kind of morality. He emphasized repeatedly that sex is a normal biological function, listen, acceptable in whatever form it is manifested. And he really meant in whatever form it is manifested. To liberate sex from morality, Kinsey reduced it to the sheer act of physical orgasm. He then claimed that all orgasms are morally equivalent, whether between married persons or unmarried persons, between people of the opposite sex or the same sex, between adults and children, between strangers or with prostitutes, even between humans and animals. This is the hero that some celebrate. He ignored the fact that these situations involve vastly different relational, emotional, social, and moral and spiritual dimensions. All of them he labeled simply sexual outlets. You just need an outlet. And it doesn't matter with who or how or when or how many times. And he pronounced them all equally acceptable. And so we have the birth of our current slogan. Love is love. Thank you, Alfred Kinsey. Like his predecessors, Kinsey was deeply committed to Darwinism and materialism, referring to humanity in reductionist language as the human animal. That's all you are. You're no different than any other animal. Because if there is no God, you're not created in anybody's image. You're just a beast of the field. Any behavior, he would say, that could be found among animals, he considered normal and normative for humans as well. Whatever the animals do should be normal for us as well. For example, he claimed that certain mammals are observed to have sexual contact between males and even across species. Therefore, he concluded that both homosexuality and bestiality are part of the normal mammalian picture, acceptable for all humans as well. He lumped it all in the same category. Kinsey claimed his approach was scientific, and yet his research methods were anything but scientific. This is the little secret that people don't think about or know about. When he did his research and he compiled all his studies and the statistics, and everybody thought it was an amazing research that he did, what they didn't know was that his research samples included a disproportionate percentage of sex offenders, I had trouble with that in the last service too, masochists, voyeurs, exhibitionists, and pedophiles who were in prison. That was his sample group. The pedophiles in particular were engaged in illegal behavior as he did the study. Yet Kinsey took them at their word when they claimed that the children were actually sexually enjoying the experience. Kinsey showed no concern about his unscientific research methods because ultimately he was not driven by science. According to Stanford professor Paul Robinson, Kinsey viewed history as a great, quote, as a great moral drama in which the forces of science competed with those of superstition, end quote, by which he meant religion and morality. Kinsey believed that humanity needed to be redeemed and liberated from the biblical sexual ethic. His influence on our university system is incalculable. Sexual liberation would be the means for saving humans from the oppression of religion and morality. That's Alfred Kinsey. And then there's Wilhelm Reich, born 1897, died in 1597, or 1957, we went backwards. In the 1960s, psychologist Reich became a cult figure in the human potential movement. In fact, it was he who wrote a book and coined the phrase sexual revolution. Wrote a book by that title. He preached the gospel of redemption through complete immersion in the sexual instincts. That's what you got to do. He would say the core of happiness in life is sexual happiness. Again, repeating basically what Freud said. If you can't have sexual happiness, it's impossible for you to be happy in life. Therefore, you've got to pursue your sexuality. He promised that all human dysfunctions could be fixed by developing, quote, the capacity for surrender to follow the biological energy without any inhibition, the capacity for complete discharge of all damped up sexual tension through involuntary, pleasurable contractions of the body. He believed in sexual salvation through sex. That's a book that describes his approach. That's what they titled it, Salvation Through Sex. It explains that for him, orgasm, quote, is man's only salvation leading to the kingdom of heaven on earth. Reich's ideas were widely dismantled or disseminated through a 1966 novel by Robert Rimmer, which sold 3 million copies and was required reading in college courses on marriage and family. This book, back in the 60s, is credited with being the main force behind the creation of co-ed dormitories in American universities. His view on sex is frankly religious. One character in his book states that intercourse, quote, is actually an act of worship, end quote. Another says, quote, when lovers feel for each other in this moment, sexual intercourse is no other than the adoration in the full religious sense, end quote. Through sex, we see that the beloved is, quote, the naturally divine, end quote. In a postscript to the 1990 edition of the novel, Rimmer wrote that sex can, quote, become a new religion, a humanistic religion without any necessity of God, end quote. Clearly, the architects of the sexual revolution were driven by nothing less than a vision of redemption through our sexuality. But why do these atheist materialists choose sex as their means of salvation? Because in materialism, the core of human identity is in the biological, the natural, the instinctual, especially for them, the sexual instincts. Sex is, after all, central to the survival of the species. Darwin's theory of evolution even elevated reproduction as the linchpin of the evolutionary progress. Whoever has the most viable offspring wins. So sex becomes the center point of evolution itself. And then there's Michel Foucault, born in 1926, died in 1984. Foucault, a French postmodernist and the author of a 3-volume study on the history of sexuality, writes that in the past, biologists treated sex and reproduction as merely one among many functions of an orgasm. But in the space of a few centuries, sex went from being just one activity of life to being our core identity. In Foucault's words, geneticists now, quote, see in the reproductive mechanism that the very element which induces the biological dimension, the matrix not only of the living, but also of life itself, end quote. Sex is treated as, quote, the master key to knowing who we are. Sex, the explanation for everything. He goes on to say, sex is worth dying for. It is more important than our soul. And he died in 1984 of AIDS. So, back to our original question. Why is sexuality such a big deal to our culture? Because we've had hundreds of years of godless people spreading doctrines of demons. That's why. And all of us have been discipled at their feet. You have, I have, our kids and our grandkids are. We send our children to universities that take a deep dive into what I've described today. That's how their sexuality is formed. And we pay thousands and thousands of dollars for it to happen. So why is sexuality such a big deal in our culture? Because without God, we have to find our identity in something, and sex is that something. Our sexuality becomes our core identity. I no longer practice heterosexuality. I am a heterosexual. And because I am oppressed by someone else's moral standards, I must express my sexual desires in order to be my authentic self. I must claim my sexual identity. And any disagreement with my sexual identity is an attack on my very self, the core of who I am. Through the influence of those who have rejected the existence of God, sexuality has become the center of our existence and our culture. And what is most concerning is that there are scores of Christian people who are adopting a version of personhood that was birthed from the bankruptcy of atheism. We've been discipled by our culture, and it is time to reclaim our dignity as men and women who've been created in God's image as male and female with a specific design and a glorious purpose. The last scripture I want to leave you with is one that we've read multiple times. It's from the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. He says this: "Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, in view of the mercies of God, I urge you to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true worship. Do not be conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may discern what is the good, pleasing, and perfect will of God." Let's pray. Father, I pray for those among us who are sinking into the abyss of these godless, demonic ideologies. Father, would you rescue us from that? Would you bring us dignity once again as men and women who are created in your image by your design with a purpose? God, would you renew our minds? And Father, for those in our world and our culture who are promoting these things with much vigor, I pray that you would stand against them, Lord. Confuse them, confound them. May they fail. And may you deliver us from this moment. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. I love you. And thank you. And I'm just going to leave it at that. I'll see you back next week.